Okay, so today I wanted to talk a little bit about what's known as ennui. And like existentialism, it's a little bit difficult to discuss in a few minutes or less. It's something where you could pretty much have an entire class on it, like not class session, but an entire semester long class. But basically, for our purposes, we're going to focus on how ennui manifests itself in literature, especially modernism, and then definitely in postmodernism. And if you remember in the existentialism micro lecture that we put up there, the idea that there's no single truth within the universe with a capital T, but if you peel back everything, it's just nothing, right? And that's sort of the joke, right? We all are born and we find out along the way there's nothing there, and then we die, essentially. So ennui sort of stems from that. It's a concept that's brought up by a German philosopher named George Steiner in a book called In Bluebeard's Castle. Okay, and so in this book, he has a whole bunch of different things that are going on. Steiner shoots off in a bunch of different directions, but basically the idea that ennui is, sort of a metaphysical boredom, essentially something in which, because there's no central answer, or you can't find or access a central answer, it's just that you don't know what to do with yourself. Okay, and so a good example, somewhat pat, but if you know the stereotype of the midlife crisis, right, for guys in particular, they will find out that their lives have not really meant as much as they wanted them to, and then go out and get like a brand new Mustang or Corvette or something. So in some ways they have sort of found this metaphysical boredom. They're trying to figure out how to deal with it. So to go back to In Bluebeard's Castle, what George Steiner says is that if you take a look at humanity in general and human culture, humanity itself has gone through several cycles of ennui, in which there's this sort of metaphysical boredom, doesn't know how to make progress, or if it does make progress, it ends up killing or hurting a bunch of people. And then George Steiner will say that one of the things that you can see as people try to get out of this notion of ennui, humanity itself, is that it tries to destroy a fundamental part of itself, to try to shock itself back awake and start moving towards the future again. And so he, and this is all again very simplified, but he basically says if you take a look at human history from the 1900s or late 1800s onwards, and even a little bit further than that, you'll see that there'll be cycles of progress, and then stagnation, and then from there's going to be some sort of massive tumult that occurs. And so he'll point to the Armenian genocide, World War I, the Holocaust, these sorts of things are as all attempts for humanity to try to get itself back to understanding itself and making progress again. So it's kind of an unusual concept, but tearing apart a vital part of itself. So what do we think about this book, In Bluebeard's Castle? Okay, the French story of Bluebeard is really where he gets this, and I'll tell you the story really quickly because I think it helps people understand what he's going for. And so he will say that in the myth of Bluebeard, there's this wealthy prince or king, I can't remember which one, and he falls in love with this woman, and they get married, and on the first day of their marriage, he takes her out to their castle. And at the castle, they go through, and like, here is where the kitchen is, here is where the living room is, here is where the bathrooms are, all of these other sorts of things. And then they get to a door, and he's like, and here's a door that you can never open. Okay, whatever you do, you're not allowed to go in that door at any point in time. Stay away from it. It's got like chains and stuff on it. And so anyway, of course, time passes. She grows more suspicious of this, and as fairy tales go, she opens the door. And if you remember Grimm's fairy tales, right, we have the PG versions of Grimm's fairy tales, and then the real versions of Grimm's fairy tales. And this is, the uncensored version of In Bluebeard's Castle. And she opens up the door, and she finds all of the mutilated and decapitated and dismembered bodies of all of the wives and girlfriends that this Bluebeard guy has had before. And so a whole bunch of different things stems out of that. But one of the things to keep in mind on this is that is where Steiner is really sort of picking up his theory, that sort of parable of sort of being trapped in sort of a meaningless existence as this woman is, and then pulling open the door and seeing all the horrors that people can be capable of, and then saying, gosh, we probably should do something about this. And then after a while, that motivation peters out, and then we go back to lassitude, and then the horror begins, and we say, gosh, we should do something about this. And it's just a cycle that continues over and over and over again. If you're a philosophy fan, this sounds a little bit like, and on purpose, the whole idea of thesis and antithesis. And Heidegger was one of the guys behind that, and Hegel, if I remember correctly. But anyway, the idea that in stasis, right? So that there's going to be a movement and then anti-movement, and those two are going to collide, and that creates a new stasis. And then that's going to be an antithesis that comes to the new thesis, and they collide, etc. So anyway, how does this affect literature? If you take a look at a lot of the postmodern literature, you get some inklings of it in modernism, especially with F. Scott Fitzgerald, and Hemingway for that matter. But as we get especially at postmodernism, a lot of the characters are very rudderless. Okay, there's really no purpose to their existence, and they're aware of that fact. And so there's different things that are going on out there that they're trying to prevent, or trying to get themselves awakened from this sort of torpor. And so it's not unusual that this book is written, okay, around the same era in which we see Americans all sort of coming back from World War II and moving into planned communities where every house is the same, okay, and you've seen those pictures before, I'm sure. Everybody has the same sort of car. Everyone's a middle manager at a bank or a factory or something like that, and there's nothing else there. And so you see a lot of this. If you see a story written post-1940s in the suburbs of America, ennui is a massive concept. And so I bring up Revolutionary Road by Richard Russo, and I think that later became a movie. But anyway, in Revolutionary Road, it's a guy who thinks he's going to get a promotion at a bank. He doesn't get the promotion, but his wife got pregnant, anticipating that they would have extra money to support another child. And then he comes home and tells her that he didn't get the promotion, and so she performs an abortion upon herself and dies in the bathtub as a result. And that's a big novel, a lot more complexity there, but that's sort of a manifestation of this ennui concept, that there's going to be a stasis, and then something happens, and then people try to make some sense of it, or something that's trying to snap themselves back to reality. So with the suburbs in particular, if you can imagine an era in which everybody's houses look the same, you've come back from a war theater in which is pretty much either complete boredom or nonstop terror, okay, one or the other, and then you work at a bank 9 to 5, and you come home to the same house as everybody else, the same car as everybody else, the same 1.5 kids, the same dog and cat as everybody else, and you have to wonder where that meaning is. And so what a lot of these authors are doing when they mix suburbia and ennui together is that they're saying, look, outside of this American dream, right, where everyone has a house, everyone has a car, and a loving wife who stays at home, okay, usually in this concept, and inside of this, okay, there is nothing but, just boredom and terror, okay, and they will often write about sort of the scandals that lie underneath of this sort of facade of the American dream. If you take somebody 3 doors down, okay, in the 1950s, they go to work, they do their thing, they come back, they're a contributing member of society, but maybe they're having multiple affairs, maybe they take a lot of drugs, maybe their marriage isn't so great, maybe there's domestic violence involved, all of these sorts of things. And so that's what a lot of artists are trying to depict, that sort of the ennui behind the curtain that's causing all of these lashing outs or disruption behind the conformity that we see. So an example I'll bring up to just sort of help illuminate this is you talk to your grandparents or your parents, they will all say, well, in the 1950s, everything was just fine. We didn't have issues such as abortions or homosexuality or, all drug use, all these other sorts of things. And the answer, and the artists prove this, is that yes, all of those issues that we have today existed. It's just that everyone was a lot better at keeping them in their houses, okay? And so the idea of domestic violence. You can talk to some of your parents and grandparents, especially your great grandparents, and you will hear sometimes things like, well, we didn't have that issue back then. Okay, well, yeah, you did. It's just it didn't leave the walls of the house. Okay, yes, there was such a thing as home style abortions, either herbal remedies or bathtub abortions as they were known. It's just never left the walls of the house. And so a lot of authors during that time period depicting sort of the decay, the boredom, the violence that's behind this comfortable facade in the 1940s and 50s and 60s onwards, okay, until we start getting to our counterculture in the late 60s and early 70s of the suburbs, okay, all of this stuff that's going on, the American dream, and then basically the decay behind it. So that's Ennui and Suburbia, somewhat in a nutshell. So as always, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. Again, if you're interested, this is a book I don't encourage people to go out and read, but this is a guy, it's tough stuff to get through. It's definitely very philosophical, but this is what we have now to help us out when we think about what changes as we move into postmodernism and sort of go from a more global perspective into just this one house or even into just this one living room, and no one seems to be doing anything. And so what's the purpose of that? And ennui is one of the explanations behind that.